On a sleepy Sunday morning in 1941, the Hawaiian island of Oahu could not have seemed more peaceful or idyllic. Even with the relatively recent arrival of the United States Pacific Fleet, which had been relocated from San Diego to its new home base at Pearl Harbor, the presence of this fleet seemed to herald nothing more than a display of American naval prestige. Lined up off Ford Island were 7 of the United States' most powerful battleships. This section of the harbor had become appropriately known as Battleship Row, and the sight of these seemingly invincible vessels was bound to convince everyone that American might was unquestionable. And yet, the sun was rising, literally and figuratively, casting its rays upon a vast fleet of aircraft that buzzed through the morning skies and into history. Today, we're going to look at real and rare footage from that day that changed everything in history. At 6:30 in the morning, Navy sailors aboard ships anchored in Pearl Harbor began their daily routines. They awoke to what seemed like an ordinary Sunday, unaware of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. These men went about their duties, oblivious to the fact that in a few minutes they would face one of the most devastating and historic battles in the history of the U.S. Navy. 15 minutes later, signs began to emerge that this would be no ordinary day. One of the leading Japanese submarines had been sighted. The USS was patrolling outside the harbor when it saw a periscope above the water. The ship engaged the unidentified submarine and sent a notification of the incident to command. The message, when decoded, read, "Enemy submarine sunk 1 mile south of Pearl Harbor." Well, our communications officer was shocked when he saw that. He was certain that they did not mean submarine sunk. They probably meant sighted. This vital advance warning was ignored. Had the message been transmitted correctly, aircraft and battleships could have been prepared in advance, and the United States Navy could have averted the catastrophe that was about to occur. By 7 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft was approximately 130 miles, or about 130 kilometers, from Pearl Harbor. Fast forward a few months, and in April of that year, Imperial Japanese Navy pilots began practicing mock attacks on U.S. ships. As these pilots trained, they gained more experience that could then be incorporated into the overall plan. To aid them, the Japanese admirals had a huge model of Pearl Harbor built, with which they could finalize every detail of the attack plan. But in order to perfect it, they needed intelligence. Enter Taiko Yoshikawa, a young Japanese naval officer who was sent to Oahu to spy on the American fleet. With no access beyond that of a common tourist, Yoshikawa managed to gather a remarkable amount of information about the fleet in the surrounding airfields that protected it simply by observing, with a large Japanese-American population on the island. He attracted little attention and often sat in a tea house overlooking the harbor, observing the movement. Using his encyclopedic knowledge of American shipping, he constructed a detailed picture of the daily routine. Perhaps his best-known activity was posing as a tourist and chartering a pleasure plane to discreetly photograph the harbor from above. This detailed information was then forwarded to Tokyo, where it was incorporated into the final plans. In the final stages of the plan, it was decided to use 2-man submarines to infiltrate the harbor and attack American ships. While their crews were busy with the air attack, 6 aircraft carriers would approach stealthily from northern Oahu and launch 2 waves of aircraft to designated targets in the early hours. After refueling, a 3rd wave would destroy ships and installations, rendering Pearl Harbor inoperable. A proposed invasion of Hawaii was considered, but cancelled. Diplomatic attempts to avert war continued until November. On November 20th, Japan offered to withdraw from Indochina in exchange for an end to sanctions and fuel, an offer rejected by the US, which demanded a withdrawal from mainland China. Yamamoto assembled a fleet of 6 aircraft carriers in over 4 0.0 aircraft. Battleships, cruisers and destroyers were also part of the main force. He set out on the 26th, November 1941, gambling on surprise. Despite the risk of detection, Yamamoto ordered his fleet to sail under absolute radio silence with submarines in the lead to avoid any American detection. U.S. intelligence focused on the Philippines, intercepted Japanese communications, but ignored signs of an attack on Pearl Harbor. Warnings were sent repeatedly, but excessive frequency led to complacency. Admiral Kimmel concentrated limited maritime patrols on the routes near Pearl Harbor, anticipating submarine attacks, while Lieutenant General Short increased airfield security in anticipation of domestic sabotage. But his actions were met with skepticism. The lack of a unified command in the belief that the attack would occur in the Philippines left Pearl Harbor vulnerable. On December 2nd, Yamamoto ordered the attack on the base via code. Their primary target was the U.S. aircraft carriers, but the USS Saratoga was undergoing refit in the U.S. Enterprise in Lexington had departed on missions, making them impossible to destroy. Despite this, the attack continued, seeking to weaken the U.S. fleet and prepare the way for future confrontations, although the central targets were not reached. On the night of December 6, 1941, in the last hours of peace, U.S. cryptographers began intercepting a flurry of coded transmissions throughout the Pacific, certain of its significance, lacking the full picture. They expected the Japanese to attack Southeast Asia and the Philippines, but no such warning reached Pearl Harbor before the sun began to rise over Oahu. At 7:00 a.m. on the day of the attack, an Army lieutenant ignored his radar's crucial report, believing the signals indicated a flight of American planes, possibly B-17 bombers, scheduled to arrive that day, and told them not to worry because it was a flight of B-17s coming from California. But when you approach Oahu from California, you're not coming from the north, you're coming from the east. 7:00 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft arrives at the island of Oahu. The quiet morning was shattered by the roar of planes, and a wave of fear and panic swept through the naval base out of the mists of the Pacific. Like tiny grasshoppers, they rose from the sea, from the southeast and from the north. Unbeknownst to them, the hitherto reluctant United States would soon be drawn into World War II, forever altering the course of history. Until December 1941, the United States pursued a carefully calculated policy of staying out of the war, because many Americans internally did not want to be drawn into a conflict. They believed that it had nothing to do with them. At the same time, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was eager to assist the Allies by shipping supplies across the Atlantic, and also by providing warships. There was therefore a fine line that Americans had to balance. If Great Britain were to fall, the Axis powers would control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australasia, as well as the seas, and would be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources to bear on this hemisphere. Thinking in terms of today and tomorrow, I make a direct statement to the American people. There is far less chance of the United States entering the war if we do everything we can now to support the nations defending themselves against Axis attacks than if we passively accept their defeat. All this would change in December 1941, when suddenly out of nowhere, the Hawaiian port of Pearl Harbor came under brutal attack by the Japanese. At 7:49 a.m., the commander of the first wave gave the order. The attack on Pearl Harbor was to proceed. 6 minutes later, the coordinated attack on Pearl Harbor began. The Japanese dropped bombs, torpedoes, and fired relentlessly on the Pacific Fleet in the air bases. American guns began firing rapidly, with a vast volume of ammunition available. Dive bombers struck American air bases throughout the U.S., beginning with Hikon Field, the largest of the bases, and Willafield, the principal fighter base of the United States Army Air Force DOT. The men at the air bases tried to react, but the tight grouping of planes made them easy targets for Japanese bombers. At Pearl Harbor, some 15 miles to the west, Japanese aircraft had the U.S. Pacific Fleet in their sights. On the morning of the 7th, an alarm from General Quarters, the combat position, sounded, warning that something serious was afoot. Thuds and explosions began to be heard, growing in intensity and proximity. The emergency message broadcast, Red Air Raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not an exercise unprepared for the attack. The warships had only minimal power supplies, and ammunition had to be carried manually by the crews. Meanwhile, Japanese planes passed close to the ships, with pilots laughing during the mission. The Americans believed the water was too shallow for torpedo attacks, but the Japanese had developed special torpedoes for shallow waters, causing immediate devastation. At 8 a.m., the USS West Virginia was hit by 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Chaos ensued throughout the fleet. The attack on Battleship Row progressed rapidly. In the first 5 minutes, 4 battleships were hit, including the USS Oklahoma and the USS Arizona. Minutes later, the Arizona exploded after being hit by a bomb in its gunpowder stores, sinking and taking 117 lives. The explosion sent fire and burning oil over the water, and black smoke filled the sky, and the interior of the ship was also on fire. Young sailors tried to escape by jumping from the tower into the water, some surviving and others not. By 8:10, the USS Arizona was in pieces. The USS Oklahoma, with 1,000 men on board, was hit by 3 torpedoes and turned upside down as water rushed inside. More than 30 servicemen were trapped and fighting for their lives. Crewmen tried to stave off the flooding by using clothing and blankets to hold back the flooding, but water continued to pour in. Meanwhile, the naval air station at Kanawai was also on fire, but sailors were still trying to respond to the Japanese bombardment. The first wave of attacks was winding down, but Japanese pilots made final attempts on the base. The air base was completely devastated, with charred wreckage of planes, broken propellers, and bodies strewn across the landscape. The American troops felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. The surprise attack had taken a massive toll, leaving many bewildered, angry, or in tears at the destruction. By 8:54 at 10:00 a.m., the second wave of 170 aircraft began the attack. They were divided into 3 groups, mostly focused on the same targets. With the base now on high alert, the Japanese plan was less successful. At the air bases and on the ships, the Japanese faced a barrage of fire. American resistance was better coordinated. The sky was filled with planes and explosions, reminiscent of a flock of birds in chaotic motion. After devastating Battleship Row in the first wave, the Japanese pilots turned their sights on the ships anchored in the shipyards. Destroyers such as the USS Kasane and the USS Downs were badly damaged during the second attack, parked in Dry Dock Number 1 alongside the battleship USS Pennsylvania. They were hit by bombs and engulfed in fires caused by ruptured fuel tanks. At 9:00 a.m., the Japanese targeted the USS Show by dropping several bombs on the ship. The spectacular explosion of her forward locker created one of the most iconic images of the entire attack. As the Show went up in flames, the Nevada attempted to escape to the open sea. The second wave of places dropped several bombs on the ship, hitting the forward and middle of the vessel. If the Nevada were to sink, it would block the escape route to the sea, leaving the remaining ships in Pearl Harbor as easy targets. The Nevada eventually ran aground at Hospital Point, escaping the inferno and keeping the vital channel clear. At 10:00 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack force decided to withdraw, leaving a devastated Pearl Harbor behind. Concerned about possible American counterattacks and risking exposing his fleet to even greater danger, Admiral Nagumo ordered a retreat. Although the attack was highly successful, key targets such as fuel depots and shipyards remained intact, which would later prove crucial to the United States recovery. In just 2 hours, 21 American warships were sunk or damaged, eight aircraft destroyed, and 2,403 military and civilian casualties were reported killed. Many of the ships were repaired and returned to fight in subsequent battles, and crucially from the US perspective, the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were not at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack, thus escaping any damage, something that would prove vital in the later phases of the Pacific War. The reason the attack was so symbolic and so successful was the fact that America had never been attacked in such a way on its own soil, especially in the modern era. It was proof that the Japanese were a highly mechanized, utterly ruthless force, capable of committing an act of what could almost be called terrorism, of sheer audacity and violence, that had not only a very strong military and naval purpose, but also a profound psychological effect. It essentially made Americans, who in recent years had been relatively complacent about the war, many believing that it would not affect us, realized that the conflict was now on their doorstep, whether they wanted to or not. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, 68 civilians were killed. Tragically, life was lost, with the vast majority of casualties being military personnel. A total of 2,235 service members were killed, bringing the total death toll to 2,403. Many of the civilian deaths were caused by stray anti-aircraft shells that... Hello NBC, hello NBC. This is Ku in Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We witnessed this morning in the distance a major battle at Pearl Harbor and a severe bombing raid by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu was also attacked and suffered considerable damage. This battle has now lasted almost 3 hours. This is no joke, this is real war. The magnitude of the tragedy as unfolding began to unfold, and President Franklin Roosevelt acted swiftly, indecisively on December 8, 1941. The following day, he addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech, a show of force that would forever be etched in American history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the request of Japan, was still in talks with its government and its emperor, seeking to maintain peace in the Pacific. The events of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces and the unwavering determination of our people, I ask the Congress to declare that since the unprovoked and cowardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the state of war has existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan. President Roosevelt is alerted to the events at Pearl Harbor shortly afterward from the start of the attack, due to the time difference between Oahu and Washington, D.C. It was early afternoon when Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, burst into a meeting between the President and his advisor, Harry Hopkins, reporting that the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt recalled that her husband had appeared calm and collected as he received the latest news of the attack. But she knew deep down that he was outraged by the attack, considering all he had done to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis with Japan. Furthermore, the manner in which Japan initiated the war further irritated him in his cabinet, as it was insulting. 7.5 hours after the bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese delivered their declaration of war against the United States in Great Britain. Among those with whom Roosevelt consulted about the attack was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in London, who that day also saw his country at war with Japan. As he assessed the situation and what the next few days might entail, Roosevelt confided to Eleanor that he expected Germany to follow in the footsteps of its Japanese allies and declare war on the United States shortly. Almost echoing Yamamoto's own predictions, he told her that the United States was not prepared to fight the war in which it was now involved, and that it would take time to reorganize American industry, from the production of cars and refrigerators to tanks and bombs. He further said that, in his opinion, the country would have to suffer many defeats before it achieved victory. Armed with this knowledge, Eleanor Roosevelt went on the radio that evening for her weekly broadcast. Addressing an audience of shocked, angry, and frightened listeners, she reassured them, whatever is demanded of us, we will do. We are the free and invincible people of the United States. Quote, while she was speaking to the American people at home, her husband was with his secretary, Grace Talley, dictating a speech that he planned to deliver the following day to the U.S. Congress. That evening, he and his cabinet met to discuss the latest reports from Pearl Harbor. The news was horrific, casualty reports mounting exponentially with each message received. And with so many ships damaged or sunk at once, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet had suffered a significant blow in the crucial opening round of the conflict. The only saving grace was that America's aircraft carriers had miraculously been manned after a restless night's sleep. Roosevelt addressed Congress at 12:30 p.m. on December 8, 1941. He declared that since the unprovoked and treacherous attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, the state of war had existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan. Within an hour, Congress voted to renew the declaration of war on Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous, except by a lone voice, that of Jeannette Rankin, the Montana Republican and the first woman to hold federal office in the United States. Rankin voted against the statement and refused to bow to pressure from other representatives, even as she was publicly booed from the gallery. Explaining her reasoning, she said, "As a woman, I cannot go to war, and I refuse to send anyone at Pearl Harbor." The aircraft carrier USS Enterprise solemnly entered port on the afternoon of December 8th, where the crew got a close-up look at the devastation. They had narrowly escaped the day before. They had launched a wave of attack aircraft after a possible sighting of the Japanese fleet, but found nothing. Now, eager for revenge, or at least not to be left hanging, every man raced to fuel, rearm, and replenish the carrier, ready to return to sea. As news of the invasion of the Philippines spread across the Pacific to everyone there and everyone outside the United States and in American possessions around the world, there was only one thing on their minds: avenging Pearl Harbor. A brief pause. The survival of the American carriers meant that the attack would ultimately give Japan only the 6 months Yamamoto had anticipated to decisively defeat the Allies, something Japan would fail to do at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. 4 of the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor would be lost to the U.S. Air Force, a defeat from which Japan would never recover, and which would be the catalyst for the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945. Pearl Harbor left an indelible impression on the United States after World War II, especially with the onset of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The United States became increasingly wary of being caught off guard in another attack, now involving nuclear weapons, and invested billions of dollars in early warning systems and intelligence-gathering technologies. In addition, the CSS began a massive rearmament program to confront the Soviets, so that unlike on December 7, 1941, the country would always be prepared for any war. To prevent surprises like that from happening, the United States adopted a much more aggressive foreign policy toward the Soviets than it had in dealing with the Japanese in the 1930s. Meanwhile, in the West, much of Europe was under Axis control. Adolf Hitler had launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, but the expansion of his forces did not prevent him from also declaring war on the United States on December 11th, 1941. That is one of Hitler's most intriguing decisions. Why did he decide to declare war on the United States? In reality, Hitler's motive was because he believed that he would finally have the opportunity to show that he wanted to rid the world of what he saw as the evils of international finance and Jewish control over the economy. It is clear that he was completely wrong about that. Hitler was also in a pact with Japan, so he considered Japan a natural ally. And that's why, anyway, the war expanded. This was Hitler swinging his saber with no real idea of where it was going to lead. With Hitler's declaration, the United States found itself in a war on two fronts. The attack on Pearl Harbor had thrown millions of American citizens right into the heart of the conflict. It's one thing to declare war, it's quite another to execute it logistically. For the Americans, this was a gigantic challenge. They would have to fight a war in Europe, and at the same time, a war on the other side of the planet across the Pacific. This would require all the industrial might and technical know-how of the United States if they were to fight simultaneously in Europe, in the Pacific. Never in human history or memory has there been a war in which the courage, resilience, and loyalty of civilians has played such a vital role. Thousands of civilians around the world were and continue to be killed or maimed by enemy action. Our soldiers, sailors, and Marines are fighting with great bravery and skill on distant fronts to ensure that we remain safe. As we here at home reflect on our duties and responsibilities, let us think and think deeply about the example being set by our warfighters. When Japan and the United States fought that war in the Pacific, they were fighting over strategic islands. You have to think of the conflict as a kind of game of back and forth, trying to capture rocky outcrops in a vast lake. The more islands you control, the more dominance you have over the lake. And in addition to these small island battles, there were also major naval engagements such as the Battle of Midway, which again was very costly in men and material resources. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 proved to be a decisive naval battle for the United States. In the first 5 minutes, the US Air Force hit 3 Japanese aircraft carriers and a 4th was destroyed by the end of the battle. If you feel this video brought you value in any way, please subscribe to the channel. FASVIM Series. See you soon.